Good afternoon. My name is Lindsay Gibson and I'm from the University of Alberta. I'd like to recognize that we are in the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people, and one of the things from an educational standpoint, I also live in Edmonton and Treaty 6 territory, and I'm also maintain a home in Kelowna in the unceded territory of the Okanagan people. And I think it's really important that when we do these acknowledgements with our students especially, to really explain to them what does unceded territory actually mean, and why do we do these acknowledgements, and why is this important? So today I'm going to talk about about history education in Canada, which is something I've spent the last 20 years of my life devoted to, and I'm going to just start by talking a little bit about the context of history education today. And this is actually an opening piece from a grant that we wrote, an unsuccessful one, if there's any shirk applicants out there who can commiserate with me about this. And what we said is this: in a world that is increasingly complex with new communications technologies, a radically new migration context, increasingly diverse societies, whole world regions destabilized in new ways, increasing disparities in wealth, the impacts of global climate change and the belated recognition yet continued contestation of demands for reconciliation, reparations, and national status for Indigenous peoples, Canadians face a level of political, social, and cultural complexity that demands, among other things, a solid grounding in the past. Now, when we think about the context today as well, and I've only pulled one particular of the 94 calls to action that really focuses specifically on history education. How are we going to reteach the way that we teach about Indigenous peoples in Canada and the history and legacy of schools? How are we going to build students' capacity for intercultural understanding and empathy and mutual respect, and identifying teacher training needs, amongst other things? And my big question overall today, as part of my presentation, is to what extent has K-12 history education changed in the last 50 years to meet the challenges of the present context? So a lot of you might know this study from 1968. Bernie Hodgetts wrote this study. He surveyed 947 schools, elementary and secondary, started in 1965. So, I think prompted by the 100th anniversary of Canadian Confederation, 947 schools, 10,000 student essays and surveys, 1,000 teacher interviews, teacher education students, and this is the summary that we always draw out of this. We are teaching a dry as dust chronological story of uninterrupted political and economic progress, told without the controversy that is an inherent part of history. The great debates that could bring our history to life, the natural conflicts of opinion, the new interpretations of the past by successive generations of historians are all grayed out of existence. Now, I would wonder in thinking about, well, how much has things actually changed in the last 50 years? Well, the traditional approach to history education, I've used some old textbooks on the side, it was focused on nation-building grand narratives. It was focused on teaching students to learn the key facts of the past. The purpose was to promote group solidarity and pride, build a sense of national heritage and citizenship, to strengthen beliefs and values and moral habits, to learn important lessons from the past. And obviously, this particular kind of history education began when history education, when history began getting taught in schools in the 1890s, and I think in a lot of ways this still exists in some of our schools today. And I think a lot of people in the audience will say, yeah, I remember history like that. And part of the problems with this kind of approach to history is these grand narratives. These narratives that are told as an unbiased, objective, and authoritative story of the past. In English-speaking Canada, this has been dominated by the English-Canadian grand narrative that, if you read Tim Stanley's work in 2009, lays out kind of these component pieces. If we look at Le Tourneau and Lévesque and several other ones, we also see this la survivance narrative that exists in Quebec, this idea of nation building at the same time period. And the problems with these types of grand narratives is, and the traditional approach overall is, it treats history as informational. How much stuff do you know? I meet people regularly in the street and they say, I'm really good at history trivia, I guess I should be a history teacher. And I say, well, not quite. It's incredibly passive. Our students are told to learn other people's interpretations. It's uncritical. Rarely do we invite students to critique interpretations of the past or interpretations of sources that we're looking at. It's incredibly flawed in terms of their understanding of the discipline. Students grow up to think that history is facts to be remembered and not interpretations to be debated and constructed and deconstructed and reconstructed. It's teleological in the sense that it builds towards a logical conclusion, right? And part of that is this idea of natural. Students begin to see Canadian history as being, well, we are this way because that's what we were meant to be. And I remember as a history teacher, it took me 15 years to come to a realization that what I wanted my students to realize at the very end, and it seems like maybe a minor goal, was that they saw Canadian history as not being inevitable. It wasn't bound to be this way. And it was a really important understanding. Now, obviously, as well, we see that it can be exceedingly stereotypical and marginalizing to various communities, and that could be Indigenous people, but ethnic, gender, disabled people, the list goes on and on and on in terms of not seeing themselves in this curriculum, and we hear that repeatedly in history education research. How do we design a history education that students can see themselves in? Now, in the 1970s and 1990s, there was a response to this, and I call this history under threat, that we see that history was integrated into and replaced by interdisciplinary social studies and Canadian studies courses. And history scholars, education scholars like myself, are very divided about our beliefs about whether this is a good thing or not. History was very closely tied to contemporary issues and values education and citizenship education. And the goals were really about trying to teach Canadian history to contribute to a different form of citizenship, not one about patriotism and accepting other people's, but trying to take more of an activist role. Now, a lot of you who ever happen to read this book that I'm showing up on the screen here, in the 1990s and 2000s, many countries around the world went through what we call the history wars, and it was about history education, and lots of these were settler states, Australia, Canada, the United States, that really debated these stories that we were telling about the past. And they complained, they said, look, there's no, the problem with this new kind of social studies and history education kids are getting these days is that they've got no coherent story. They don't know, they don't understand or have a sense of national identity. It focuses too much on injustices and negative parts of the past, what they call in Australia the black armband history. They say that not enough time was spent on history in schools, too much focus on skills and not enough on the basic facts. They said that history's watered down in multidisciplinary social studies classes. It should be predominantly history classes. They complained about the pedagogy and said, geez, these teachers are just too student-centered these days. They care too much about these students personally, and they need to be more rigorous. They need more academic rigor, more exams, more studying, more expository essays. And they blamed everybody. They blamed social and cultural historians, they blamed multiculturalists, they blamed school boards, they blamed faculties of ed, they blamed ed professors, they blamed provincial bureaucrats for the state of history. But we saw that really at the end of these history wars, we saw some big developments, and these were not just developments in Canada, these were developments by an international history education community, and they really came up with some interesting findings. Firstly, they said, Jean Piaget is a scholar who, if you have any educational background, you might know, but he had a stage theory about learning history, and what he said was, look, students can only begin to learn history in its abstract forms when they get older. And in Britain, a famous history education scholar, for some reason, came up with a number and said it's 16.8 years old. Okay, so students only really begin to understand history when they reach 16.8. And I would have loved to be around at what's 0.8 of a year, and whenever that point was, what it would have looked like when they became able to deal with the complexity of history. So these historians really, and history educators, tore this theory apart and said, look, what we know is students are bringing an incredible source and wealth of knowledge. They learn it from their families, they learn it from television, they learn it from heritage minutes, they learn it from all of these things that we can think of that were part of the construction of history for us. The second big piece that came about was there was a consensus among scholars and said, we really think that the goal of history education is not to fill them full of facts, but it's really to teach them deeply to think about history, historical thinking. And a lot of scholars spent some time thinking about, well, what exactly does this look like? And what they said was that we really have two kinds of concepts in history that we want students to understand. We want them to understand the stuff, the substance of history, but we also want them to understand what we call these second-order concepts, how we organize and think about the stuff of history. So things like significance and continuity and change and evidence and historical perspectives. How do we help students really think? And we said, in a lot of ways, it's quite unfair to think that students are going to learn the history not only of Canada, but in lots of cases the world, by the time they reach 18. Now, I'm only 42 years old. I've been at this for a while, and I've got some pretty big gaps in my historical knowledge, and I don't know why we expect 18-year-olds to be able to do the same thing. So they really said the goal then is, if we can't fill them up full of stuff, maybe the goal is that we can really teach them to think deeply about history, that regardless of the history that they learn throughout their lifetime, once they get outside of school, when they're sitting around the dinner table, when they're talking in their community, can they think about this in really sophisticated ways? And the last idea was really about progression. How can we understand how students' thinking progresses over time period? So there's some really key understandings for this, and what we teach students is we say, look, there's a difference between history and the past, and we've done this with kindergarten students and grade 1 students all the way up to our graduate students, and they see this difference of saying, oh, the past is everything that ever happened, and history is a selection. We've chosen some elements out of this to construct into our narratives. The second one, that history is constructed from evidence left behind. There's no one inventing this. It's not the Wizard of Oz. That people are really, that we only have what we have. And we analyze this evidence to construct it, and sometimes there's an absence of evidence, and sometimes we have to be able to make our best inferences about what we think might have happened or what it meant. Our interpretation of evidence and what we include or don't include in our narratives changes the stories that we tell. History is partial and selective. There's no such thing as one true history, but there may be multiple plausible types of or conclusions about history. And lastly, this is one I battle with all the time with people in society and other things who say, oh, you're all just a bunch of revisionists. And what we say to them is, well, look, every history is revisionist in the sense that it's shaped by the conditions and priorities in the present, and we revise these as we as things change, as we get new perspectives on society as we go through. So Peter Satius, my PhD supervisor, and a lot of people in this room have drawn from his theories. He kind of mapped out a framework of saying, this is what historical thinking is, and let's conceptualize this. And if any of you know Peter, he'd be the first one to say to you, this is not the or only model of historical thinking. This is the best we had at the time period. And he'd be happy to debate anybody about what else, and is very aware of these other concepts that might be included in it. Now, I'm not going to go through them in any great detail. Now, the important understandings for us about this kind of history was to say that these historical thinking concepts are, yes, concepts for students to understand, but what they are really about are the problems of doing history. How do we construct an understanding of the past using evidence? How do we deal with trying to understand a time period in the past where their values and beliefs might be so different than what we believe today? That we know that there's different conceptions of historical thinking. And what I've really found is powerful as these concepts over the last 10 years we've worked with them is that it's established a vocabulary for people across Canada and internationally to talk about history in the same way. And we heard this today. I tweeted out earlier during the earlier pieces, if it would have been a drinking game, we'd all be in trouble. Every time we took a drink, if historical thinking was mentioned. It was mentioned already dozens upon dozens of times already. So, and lastly, and this is a big understanding for teachers, historical thinking concepts mean nothing without content. We can't just do historical thinking about nothing. And a lot of teachers in their practice, we say, how do we combine the content, what you're studying with these concepts to help students understand this more deeply? Okay. So, well, why do we want to do this with students? Why do we think this is relevant? Well, from our experience, it's more interesting for students to do history than it is to memorize history. So for a long time period, I think a lot of you could relate to this, that we were always taught to memorize and learn other people's conclusions about history. But yet in math class, we get students to do math. In science, they get to do experiments. But in history, we never get to do any of this. So how can we get them doing history? It deepens understanding of students about how historical knowledge is created, right? We don't have people debating and saying, oh, if you take down that monument, you're erasing history. Oh, wait a second, history is constantly constructed. We're in constant conversation. I understand why there's different interpretation and how there's different interpretations. It strengthens our abilities to think, to ask questions, to communicate, to do all of these other pieces. It deepens our understanding of the past and its relationship with the present. And lastly, this is a big concept, and I see this as being really central to the work about making history relevant. How do we help students improve their historical consciousness? Their ability to make sense of the past, to orient themselves into the present, but to help them make ethical decisions into the future. If that's not the purpose of history education, I'm not sure exactly what it is. So in terms of successes, for those of you involved in the Historical Thinking Project, we had enormous success over time. 8 provinces have now included historical thinking as important goals or frameworks of inquiry in the curriculum. We have, the historical thinking concepts have been integrated into dozens of textbooks and countless resources across Canada from many of our partners, Historica, Canada's History. Lots of these resources that have been coming out include these. Teachers have written materials and uploaded onto the website. We have 3,000 sets of historical thinking posters in French and English all across Canada. Every year we host a Historical Thinking Summer Institute, and by my count we're roughly around 600 teachers across Canada now have received intensive training on embedding historical thinking as part of their regular practice of teaching history. We've done hundreds of professional development across Canada, and we had an annual general meeting with historians, history educators, museum people, museum educators, curators, ministry officials, and these meetings were really helpful in terms of building a united vision in terms of what are we trying to do in history education. Right? We also see, for example, in heritage fairs in BC that I've been involved with, the historical thinking concepts are used to assess students' assignments. And if you want to be really impressed, listen to a student explain to you from grade 4 why their project is historically significant, what evidence they use to construct their understanding of their particular topic. And we see this being used in the GG Awards and in assessments and various teachers' awards across Canada. Now, my last couple points are just about, okay, well, your question was, well, how has history education changed, and what does this even mean? And how have the changes that have taken place, does it help us be able to deal with the realities of what we're going to be facing in the present, but also in the future? And the answer to that question is a difficult one. We have an incredible network of history educators across Canada. People get confused all the time. They say to me, are you a historian? I say, no. Are you a teacher? Well, not exactly. Well, what do you do? Well, I teach teachers and I work with curriculum and I do other things about teaching history. And we have a network. I see my colleagues, Catherine Duquette and Rose Fine-Meyer and others in the crowd today who've really devoted themselves to this kind of work. And the goal of this group is to say, how can we better understand how history education, how students are learning history? And so the research that's really gone on has looked in these particular areas. How do students actually learn history? What kinds of things, by going into classrooms and assessing their thinking, what really works and what doesn't work? How do history teachers teach? What are the struggles they face? What kinds of training do they need? Is the training they're getting sufficient for what they're actually doing? How do history teachers learn how to teach? And lastly, what messages do textbooks convey? Well, the difficulty with this research is that we're not really sure. From a research standpoint, we have a great community of colleagues working in Quebec and also in English Canada. They're increasingly collaborating together. Kate and I, for example, are working on a big study right now that's studying students' narratives in grade 5 and grade 10 about Canadian history, comparing them between Alberta and Quebec, and using some pedagogy that we think might have an impact on changing the narratives that they might actually tell. But the difficulty is that we're not really sure what's going on in history education across Canada. Here we are 50 years after Hodgetts, and we actually can't say in the same definitive way that he did of saying what exactly is going on. I'd like to tell you a story and say, hey, we've transformed it, it's completely changed the way that teachers are teaching and students are learning, it's having a big impact on society, but we can't do that. So what I'd like to leave with today is myself, the principal investigator Carla Peck, who's my colleague at the University of Alberta, 20 other co-applicants, history education researchers across Canada, proposed a project called Thinking Historically for Canada's Future. It's a SSHRC partnership grant. It involved 50 partners across Canada. It's a 7-year, $2.5 million project. We applied for an LOI, which is the letter of intent, which is we call the greatest misnomer in history. A letter of intent, you'd think it might be a nice letter. It's 150 pages long. We applied. We were successful. We received the first round. After you get through the LOI, they say to you, okay, you went through that. Now we'll actually let you submit the full project. So we submitted the full project last year in February, and we found out in the spring that they said this is a great project. We would recommend it for funding, but there just isn't any funding. So that was so much fun for us. What we decided that we're going to do it all over again. So, and not to be glib, but we learned a lot from that project, and we tried to bite off more than I think that we could chew. And I think that not getting that grant was one of the best things that happened to us, because it helped us and our partners refocus. What do we really want to focus on? What really matters going forward? And so what we're planning is we're going to be submitting in February of 2018. They make you go back to zero. It's like snakes and ladders or something. And the idea is that we'll be submitting a grant in February of 2018 of this year. We hope to find out in the spring that it's successful, and then we're going to be submitting the full grant, hopefully finding out by 2019. And the questions that we want to ask are the exact same ones that we're raising here. How is history being taught by professors by teachers across Canada? We want to nurture a community, as you can see, of academic historians, researchers, Indigenous scholars, graduate students, educators in museums, archives. We want to provide opportunities to engage with this research. We want to develop and test innovations. What's actually working? We get our inspiration from Governor General's award winners, and we say, let's see what you're doing in this classroom, and what made that so powerful? Was it your passion? Was it the design? How can we replicate that? Can we try that in some other classrooms and see the degree to which that's going to be successful? We also want to engage in the development of assessment. How we know assessment drives classrooms and instruction across Canada. How do we assess whether students are actually improving their ability to think about history? And that does not mean multiple choice, fill in the blank, or knowledge regurgitation exams, but how can we find out whether we've made an impact on their ability to think historically? We want to transform classroom practices in terms of connections with groups all across Canada in designing resources and supporting them in designing resources, and conduct professional development. So in that last piece, I guess, I've maybe sold this presentation a little bit short in the sense I said to you, how has history education changed? And I think you maybe thought, well, maybe he's going to give us an answer. At a 30,000-foot level, we'd say, yes, it's changed a lot. We've got new curriculum, we've got people trained in historical thinking, we've got them pushing, we've got them working with each other and collaborating. They're thinking about how are we going to reteach history to be more inclusive in Indigenous perspectives and other perspectives. How are we going to do this? But we don't know whether it's making an impact yet, and that's what we want to find out. So we're hoping maybe next time we talk that we will have relaunched Hodgetts for 2017. To me, I think this is really the work that I want to do for the rest of my life. How can we rethink and change how our students in K-12 are thinking about the past? And we know they're bringing a lot of knowledge in from the classroom, but the point of history education to me is that if it was just about allowing students to pursue their own interests, there would be no points for school. What we want to do is bring their knowledge from their communities and from their families and from their own experience and challenge them to think and rethink and reconstruct that understanding so that they can help them orient themselves in the present and, again, make ethical decisions in the future. So I thank you.